The fire is out. Zipporah is kneeling in the dirt of a wilderness camp, a flint blade in her hand, her husband's body rigid beside her, not sleeping. Something has seized him, and it will not let go. Moments earlier, Moses had been a man walking back toward Egypt with a staff, a wife, 2 sons, and a voice from a burning bush still ringing in his ears. Now he is fighting for breath at a roadside lodging place, and his wife is the only one moving. She reaches for their son. She cuts. She touches the blood to her husband's body, and she says words that sound less like comfort than accusation. "A bridegroom of blood you are to me." The attack stops. No one explains why it happened. The narrative simply moves on, as if everyone present understood something we don't. Moses had just been commissioned by God himself, face to fire, voice to voice, days before. Now that same God had come to kill him. What happened at that lodging place? And why did a knife in a woman's hand undo it? To understand that, you have to understand what Moses was walking into, and what he was walking away from. 40 years earlier, he had fled Egypt, a fugitive, a Hebrew raised in Pharaoh's household, who had killed an Egyptian and buried the body in sand, hoping no one had seen. Someone had. He ran east, past the edge of Egyptian territory, into the wilderness of Midian, a region loosely controlled by nomadic clans descended, according to Genesis, from Abraham himself, through a different wife, a different line. There he became someone else entirely. He married Zipporah, daughter of a Midianite priest. He had sons. He kept sheep. Egypt, and everything Egypt had made him, receded into the past. Then came the fire that didn't consume the bush, and the voice that knew his name. God's commission at Horeb was staggering in scope. Moses was being sent back to the empire he'd fled, to confront the throne he'd once been raised near, to demand the release of an enslaved people from the most centralized political and religious power in the ancient Near East. Egypt, in this period, was not a fragile state. Its pharaoh was regarded as a living god, its administration vast, its army formidable. Scholars remain divided on the exact date of the Exodus. Some place it in the 15th century BC, others in the 13th. But the picture underneath the debate is consistent. Israel had no army, no king, no land of its own, only a promise and a reluctant shepherd carrying a staff. Egypt's religious world made the stakes of this mission even sharper. Pharaoh was not simply a political ruler, he was regarded within Egyptian religion as a divine or semi-divine figure, the guarantor of order itself, standing at the head of a vast pantheon of gods tied to the Nile, the sun, fertility, and the afterlife. For Moses to walk into that world and declare, on behalf of an unseen God with no temple, no army, and no throne, "Let my people go," was not simply a political demand. It was a direct challenge to an entire civilization's understanding of divine power. Later, the plagues themselves would strike specifically at the domains Egyptian religion assigned to its gods: the Nile, the sun, the livestock, the firstborn. That confrontation was still ahead of Moses on this road. But it frames why the readiness of God's chosen spokesman mattered so much before he ever reached Pharaoh's court. He was not simply delivering a message. He was about to represent the reality of Israel's God in the middle of a civilization built around the worship of others. And there is a second detail about this stretch of road worth noticing before the attack itself begins. Moses is traveling between two worlds in more than a geographical sense. Behind him is Midian, his father-in-law's household, a foreign family, a life he built after fleeing everything familiar. Ahead of him is Egypt, his birth family, his people, the covenant line he was born into but had spent decades away from. A lodging place on that road sits in neither world. It's a threshold in the most literal sense, the last resting point before a man who has lived as an outsider re-enters the identity he was always meant to carry. That geographical detail matters because thresholds are exactly where Scripture tends to locate its most unsettling encounters with God, not in the comfort of home, and not yet in the danger of the mission field, but in the unstable space between the two. Moses had objected to this calling 4 times. "Who am I? What if they don't believe me? "I am not eloquent. Please send someone else." Each time, God answered, with a name, with signs, with Aaron as a mouthpiece. By the end of Exodus 4, the objections are exhausted. Moses says goodbye to Jethro, his father-in-law. He puts his wife and sons on a donkey. He takes the staff of God in his hand. And Scripture tells us something else, something easy to read past. God has already told Moses exactly what he is about to say. "Israel is my firstborn son," God says. "Let him go, or I will kill your firstborn." That sentence is still hanging in the air, a threat about a firstborn son, spoken to a man traveling with his own firstborn son beside him, when the journey continues. At a lodging place on the way, the text says, 4 words, no fanfare, just a stop along a dusty road, the kind travelers made every night in the ancient world when the sun went down and the terrain grew unsafe to cross in darkness. A Malin. The Hebrew calls it the same root as the verb to spend the night, a resting point. Nothing eventful is supposed to happen at a lodging place. Nothing eventful happens until it does. The text gives us 4 words to set the scene, and then, without warning, this: the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. No build-up, no warning, no explanation. Look at the verb choice for a moment. The Hebrew is bakash. To seek. It's the same word used when someone searches for something lost or pursues someone with intent. This isn't a passing threat, it's active pursuit. Whatever is happening to Moses at this lodging place, God is not standing back and allowing it. God is doing it. And here's the detail worth sitting with. The text never tells us why. Not a sentence, not a clause, in a book that usually explains itself, that tells you exactly why judgment falls, exactly why blessing follows obedience. This scene offers nothing. No accusation is spoken aloud, no sin is named. The narrator simply reports the attack as if the reason were too obvious to need stating. That silence is not an accident of transmission. It reads as a deliberate literary choice, and it means whatever answer we reach has to be built from context, not from a verse that spells it out for us. There's a second layer to this ambiguity that most readers never notice at all. Read the sentence again, slowly. The Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Who is him? In English, it reads as obviously referring to Moses. He's the subject of the whole surrounding narrative. But in the Hebrew text, the pronoun is genuinely ambiguous. Nothing in the grammar of that clause locks the target down with certainty. It could be Moses. It could, plausibly, be the infant son traveling with him. This is not a fringe theory invented to make the story stranger. It's a recognized crux among scholars who work directly with the Hebrew text. A real, unresolved grammatical ambiguity, not a modern reinterpretation layered on top of a clear original. Think of it like a photograph with 2 figures standing close together, and the caption simply says, "He was in danger," without ever telling you which man the caption means. And this changes how the rest of the scene reads, because whoever the target is, the solution that follows targets a very specific, very deliberate omission. The boy has not been circumcised. To understand why an uncircumcised son could trigger something this severe, you have to go back generations, to Genesis 17, where God establishes circumcision as the sign of his covenant with Abraham's line. The language there is unusually blunt. Any male who is not circumcised, the text says, has broken my covenant. Not neglected a custom, not skipped a ritual, broken the covenant. That's a legal category, not a cultural preference. In the world of Genesis 17, this rite isn't optional decoration on a family's religious life. It's the physical seal that marks a person as belonging to the covenant people at all. It's worth noting, too, that Midianite communities, descended from Abraham through a different line, according to Genesis 25, may well have practiced circumcision on a different schedule or under different customs than the strict 8th-day requirement given to Abraham's covenant line. That difference, while not stated outright in the text, offers a plausible explanation for how a delay like this could have happened inside a mixed household without anyone treating it as an emergency, until, apparently, it became one. So when Zipporah moves, cutting off her son's foreskin with a flint knife, she isn't performing a random remedy. She's completing an obligation that Genesis 17 treats as covenant-defining. The Son of God's chosen deliverer, the man being sent to demand Israel's freedom as God's covenant people, was traveling toward Egypt without that seal in place. Not a small oversight, in other words. The live contradiction, riding on a donkey, next to the man carrying God's own staff. Here's where the timeline becomes important, because this isn't happening in a vacuum. Look at what God had just told Moses to say to Pharaoh, only verses earlier. Israel is my firstborn son. Let my son go, that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. Now watch the structure of the narrative. Moses receives that message about firstborn sons. Moses starts walking toward Egypt with his own firstborn son beside him, and at the very next stop on the road, God moves against that household. The text doesn't explain the connection outright. It doesn't need to. The placement does the explaining. It's like a director cutting from a character delivering a threat straight into a scene where that same threat is suddenly uncomfortably close to home. You don't need dialogue to feel the tension. The edit itself makes the point. Moses is about to carry a message to Pharaoh about the cost of covenant defiance regarding a firstborn son. And in his own house, walking beside him, that exact issue is unresolved. Now bring Zipporah back into focus, because up to this point, she's been a background figure, a wife, a mother, a name mentioned in passing back in Midian. In this scene, she is the only one who moves. Moses is described as under attack, incapacitated. The text gives him no action in this moment at all. It's Zipporah who takes the flint, Zipporah who performs the circumcision, Zipporah who touches the blood to the body, Zipporah who speaks. Consider who she is, a Midianite. The daughter of a priest from a people group outside Israel's covenant line, married into it rather than born into it. And yet it is precisely this woman, an outsider to the strict bloodline of Abraham, who understands what the moment requires and acts on it, decisively, without hesitation, while the appointed deliverer of Israel lies helpless beside her. Not the man with the staff of God in his hand, the woman standing next to him. This isn't the last time in Exodus that a woman will be the one who saves Moses' life. It's the latest entry in a pattern. Shiphrah and Puah, the Hebrew midwives who defied Pharaoh's order to kill Hebrew infants. Moses' own mother and sister, who hid him and positioned him for rescue. Pharaoh's own daughter, who drew him from the Nile and raised him inside the palace. Every one of those women, in some way, stood between Moses and death before he ever led anyone. Zipporah is simply the last name on that list, and, notably, one of the least remembered. Now look closely at what she says, because the words themselves carry more weight than a casual reading suggests. A bridegroom of blood are you to me. The Hebrew word behind blood here, damim, is plural, not singular. Elsewhere in the Torah, that plural form frequently carries the sense of blood guilt rather than simply blood as a substance. It's language used around violence, around a debt that blood has to settle. Scholars are genuinely divided on exactly how to read her statement, whether it's closer to, "You have cost me a husband bought back with blood," or something nearer a formal pronouncement marking the danger as resolved through covenant blood. The precise idiom may be one we've partly lost, cushioned by 3,500 years of linguistic distance, and any confident, single-sentence translation of her intent should be held loosely. But notice what isn't ambiguous. She says it twice, in consecutive verses. Twice, the narrator returns to this exact phrase, bridegroom of blood. Biblical narrators don't usually repeat a strange phrase by accident. Repetition, in this kind of text, tends to function as underlining. Whatever else is uncertain here, the text wants you to sit with those words. Blood has changed something. Blood has settled something. And the moment the blood touches Moses, the attack stops. There's also a marriage idiom worth considering underneath Zipporah's words, one many commentators point to without claiming certainty. In some ancient Near Eastern cultures, circumcision performed at or near a wedding, rather than in infancy, functioned as a rite tying a bridegroom to his wife's family and covenant. If Zipporah is drawing on a custom like that, familiar from her own Midianite background, her words may carry a double meaning. Moses has, in effect, been bound to her and to covenant obligation twice over, once through their marriage, and now again through this blood. This reading is not something the text confirms outright, and scholars remain divided on how much weight the marriage idiom explanation should carry. But it adds a plausible layer to why she reaches for that specific phrase, bridegroom, rather than simply naming Moses as husband or father. It's worth pausing here, too, on why the text stays so silent about all of this. Scripture is not usually shy about naming sin directly. Elsewhere, when judgment falls, a reason is typically given in the same breath: a broken command, a specific act of rebellion, a named transgression. Here, nothing. Some readers take that silence as evidence the event doesn't concern Moses' own conduct at all, and instead reflects something closer to a formal, legal encounter over the unresolved status of the covenant sign in his household, rather than a moral failure requiring explanation. Others take the silence as intentional restraint, since naming Moses' failure explicitly right after his call might have undercut his authority before he ever reached Egypt. Both readings are inferences drawn from the shape of the narrative, not statements the text makes outright, and it's honest to hold them that way. So he let him alone. 4 words end the crisis as abruptly as it began. No aftermath is described. No conversation between Moses and Zipporah follows. The narrative simply moves forward. Aaron meets Moses in the wilderness. The elders of Israel gather. The people believe. It's as if the entire episode is sealed shut the moment it resolves. But look at the mechanism one more time, because it's the detail the whole passage has been building toward. Blood, applied to a body, stops a divine act of death. That is not a phrase this book uses lightly, and it will not be the last time this exact mechanism appears. Before we go further, it's worth pausing on the flint knife itself, because even that detail is doing quiet work. By the time of the Exodus, metal tools were widely available. Flint was, by comparison, an old-fashioned choice, associated with earlier generations. Joshua 5 later describes another mass circumcision performed specifically with flint knives, right before Israel crosses into the Promised Land. The repetition of that specific, slightly archaic material across 2 separate covenant circumcision scenes suggests it functioned almost as a ritual callback, deliberately linking this moment on the road to the ancient covenant of Genesis 17 rather than to anything improvised or convenient. Zipporah didn't reach for whatever happened to be closest. She reached for the tool that matched the weight of what she was doing. If this is the first time you've noticed how much is compressed into 3 verses most people read past without stopping, you're not alone. This is exactly the kind of detail the Scripture Project exists to slow down on. If it's helping you see this story differently, consider subscribing. There's a lot more hiding in plain sight in the text we think we already know. Because there's one more connection still ahead, and it's the one that reframes everything we've just uncovered. Hold on to that mechanism for a moment. Blood, applied to a body, stands between a person and death at God's own hand. Now walk forward in the story. Not years forward, months. Moses will stand before Pharaoh again and again, delivering plagues that escalate toward a final judgment, the death of every firstborn son in Egypt. And on the night that judgment falls, God gives Israel a single instruction for survival. Take a lamb, kill it, and apply its blood, not to a person this time, but to the doorframes of their homes. When I see the blood, God says, I will pass over you. Sit with the architecture of that sentence for a second, because it is remarkably close to what happened at the lodging place. A death sentence in motion, blood applied at the threshold of danger. The destroyer sees the blood and stops. This is not a claim that Exodus 4 was written as a deliberate, literary prophecy of Exodus 12. The text never states that connection outright, and any commentator who presents it as a proven, intentional prediction is overstating what can actually be demonstrated from the text. What can be said, carefully, is that the pattern is there, and it's difficult to read one scene without hearing the other. Because look at who experiences this small, private version of Passover first. Not Israel, Moses. The man who will one day stand in front of the entire nation and explain what the blood on their doorposts means has already lived it, in miniature, on a dark road in the wilderness, with his own son's blood on his own body. Before Moses ever tells Israel, the blood will be a sign for you, he was the sign. Before he ever explains what it means for blood to stand between a covenant people and the destroyer, he needed it to stand between himself and the destroyer. This is where the central idea of this video sharpens into something almost startling. God's chosen deliverer wasn't simply called to lead Israel through a night marked by blood at the threshold. He had to survive his own threshold through blood first. Commission was never the finish line. It was the very beginning of a pattern that would define the whole story he was about to walk into. It's worth stepping back and asking whether this pattern is isolated to Moses, because it isn't. This same shape, a solitary night encounter with God, a physical mark left on the body, and a person who emerges changed and repositioned for what comes next, appears earlier in Genesis, at a river crossing called the Jabbok. Jacob, on the night before he is set to reunite with the brother he wronged decades earlier, is left alone. A figure wrestles with him until daybreak. Jacob will not let go without a blessing, and he walks away limping, marked permanently in his body, carrying a new name into a mission he could not have carried under his old one. The parallels are not identical in every detail, and Scripture does not draw an explicit line connecting the two scenes for us. But the shared structure is difficult to miss once you've seen it: a night, a threshold, a solitary encounter with God that leaves a permanent physical mark. A person who cannot proceed into what's ahead of them without first surviving what happens in the dark. Commentators have long noted this kind of threshold pattern recurring at pivotal moments in the biblical narrative, and Moses' night at the lodging place fits that shape closely enough that it's hard to treat it as coincidence, even while resisting the urge to claim more certainty about authorial intent than the text supports. And the pattern doesn't stop with Moses either. Decades later, as Israel finally prepares to cross into the land God promised them, Joshua 5 records something striking. An entire generation of Israelites, born in the wilderness, had never been circumcised. Before they can move forward into the mission ahead of them, God commands a mass circumcision at a place afterward named Gilgal, meaning rolling, because, the text says, God there rolled away the reproach of Egypt from them. Flint knives are used again. Blood is shed again, and only then does the nation move forward into what's next. Look at the shape of that pattern across three very different moments in Scripture: an individual patriarch at a river, an individual deliverer at a lodging place, an entire nation at the edge of a promised land. In each case, the story pauses, refuses to advance, until a covenant obligation involving blood is settled first. Calling and commission open the door. They do not, on their own, walk a person or a people through it. If this is the first time you've noticed how consistently Scripture repeats this shape, consider what it suggests about how the text itself understands readiness, not as a formality attached to the beginning of a mission, but as something the mission itself will not proceed without. The pattern shows up again, later, in a very different register, not as mercy extended at a threshold, but as the cost of ignoring one. When Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu offer unauthorized fire before the Lord in Leviticus 10, the consequence is immediate and fatal, with no extended explanation given there either. When Uzzah reaches out to steady the Ark of the Covenant in 2 Samuel 6, breaking the specific instructions for how the Ark was to be carried, the result is just as sudden. Scripture does not present these moments as arbitrary displays of divine temper. They sit inside a consistent pattern. Proximity to God's presence and God's purposes carries real weight, and the text repeatedly shows that unresolved disregard for what God has specifically required, even by people close to Him, close to his purposes, or serving at his altar, is treated with total seriousness. Set against that pattern, the lodging place scene reads less like an unexplainable outburst and more like a genuinely restrained version of something Scripture treats with consistent gravity elsewhere. Moses is met at the threshold. He is not struck down without recourse. A path back is provided and taken. That contrast matters for how the whole account should be read. This is not a story about a short-tempered God startling his own chosen deliverer for no reason. It's a story that fits inside a larger, sober pattern about what it costs to carry God's presence and purposes into the world unprepared, paired with a specific, real avenue of mercy that this particular story, unlike Nadab and Abihu's, unlike Uzzah's, actually provides. There is a version of this story most people know without ever reading Exodus 4, the version where you say yes to something and assume the yes is the hard part. You take the job, you make the commitment, you finally step into the thing you'd been avoiding out of fear or delay or a dozen good excuses. And you expect that moment, the yes, to be the crossing, the finish line of the hard part. Moses had his yes. 4 objections raised and answered, a staff in his hand, a voice still ringing in his ears from the fire. By every measure, the hard part should have been behind him. Instead, the hardest night of the journey so far was still ahead, not because his calling was in question, but because something in his own house had been left unfinished, not addressed, not urgent enough maybe, in the middle of packing a family and leaving a life behind. Easy to imagine how it happened. Easy, honestly, to recognize. Because most people carry something like that. Not a failure large enough to notice, just something unfinished, quietly set aside, that a calling doesn't automatically resolve. A conversation not had, a debt not settled, something small enough to keep postponing, right up until the moment it can't be postponed anymore. What this story does not say is that Moses was disqualified. What it says is that he was met at the threshold, not turned back from it. The danger was real, but so was the resolution. Blood was applied, and God let him go. There's something quietly steadying in that, not the promise that a calling erases what's unfinished in a life. The text doesn't offer that, but the pattern it does offer, a God who meets people at their most exposed moment, at a threshold nobody else even sees, echoes forward through the rest of Scripture, all the way to a night in Egypt when blood on a doorframe would mean the difference between death and life for an entire people. Moses survived his threshold first, not because he had already become someone flawless enough to deserve the mission, because the sign, however late, was finally in place. Maybe that's the part of this story that lingers longest, not the fear of the attack, but the quiet mercy of what came after it. There's another layer to this that's easy to miss if the focus stays only on Moses. Zipporah's role in this account raises its own quiet question worth sitting with, separate from the mechanics of the threat itself. She is not Israelite by birth. She has no covenant obligation of her own to keep this custom. And yet, she is the one who understands, in the moment that matters most, exactly what the situation requires. There's something worth noticing in the fact that Scripture's account of Israel's founding deliverance keeps circling back to people outside the expected lineage, playing decisive roles inside it. A pattern that continues well beyond Exodus, through figures like Rahab and Ruth, both outsiders who become woven into Israel's story at pivotal moments. Zipporah's flint knife belongs on that same list, even though her name rarely makes it into the retelling. None of this changes who Moses is or what he was called to do, but it does complicate the version of the story where every heroic action belongs to the person with the staff in his hand. Sometimes the person who saves the mission is not the one carrying it. Sometimes it's the person standing next to him, watching closely enough to notice what he couldn't see about his own house. It's worth asking, honestly, why a story this unsettling survived at all in the account of Israel's greatest deliverer. A later editor with an interest in polishing Moses' image had every reason to quietly drop 3 verses where God tries to kill him days after commissioning him. That the account remains unresolved and unexplained, right in the middle of the call narrative, suggests the people who preserved this text were not primarily interested in protecting Moses' reputation. They were interested in preserving what actually happened, including the parts that don't flatter their central figure, and including the parts that leave the reader without a tidy resolution. That kind of unflinching honesty is, itself, part of what makes the account worth taking seriously rather than smoothing over. A man with a staff, a road through the wilderness. A woman with a flint knife, kneeling in the dark. That's where this story lives. Not in a temple, not in a palace, but at a lodging place nobody would have remembered if God hadn't nearly ended it there. Moses had said yes to the fire, yes to the voice, yes to the mission no one else wanted, and still, the calling did not exempt him. The bush had burned and not consumed him. The road nearly did what the bush could not. Because a covenant unfinished is still unfinished, even in the hands of the one God has chosen to carry it forward. Zipporah moved. The blade found its mark, blood touched skin, and the God who had sought Moses' life let him go. Not because Moses earned it, because the sign was finally in place. A bridegroom of blood, she called him, words we still can't fully translate, spoken over a husband who nearly didn't survive his own commissioning. And months later, on a night no one in Egypt would ever forget, blood would mark a threshold again, not on a man this time, on a doorframe. And the same voice that had sought Moses' life at a lodging place would look at that blood and pass over. He was rescued by it first, before he ever explained it to anyone else. Moses didn't survive that night on the road because he had already become who God called him to be. He survived it because, at the last possible moment, the sign was finally in place, and that was enough. If this is the first time you've seen this passage slow down instead of rush past, that's exactly why this channel exists. The Scripture Project is built on the belief that the Bible rewards a closer look every time. If this study helped you see Exodus differently, consider subscribing, and if someone in your life needs to encounter this story the way you just did, send it to them. Thank you for looking closely with us today.